So today what we are doing is we're just continuing with our understanding of social psychology. And today we're basically looking at this concept called attribution. So remember in the last lesson when we talked about the beginning of this chapter, and we talked about the fact that when we use social cognition, there are a number of things that influence our social cognition or our understanding of others in our social environment. And one of the things that we use to make social judgments about others is person perception, okay? Looking at like nonverbal communication, their body language, looking at physical appearance, all that kind of stuff. Today we're looking at another aspect of social cognition, and that is called attribution. So when we're looking at attribution, when you attribute something, attribute means you're putting some kind of a cause, you're putting some kind of a source there. Okay, you're basically attributing means that you're relating it back to something. So attribution is simply the process by which we try to explain causes for our behavior as well as causes for other people's behavior. Okay, so when you're making an attribution, you're attributing behavior to some specific cause or some specific reason. So those are the two key words in our definition. Okay, attribution is the process by which we attribute or by which we identify a cause or a source or an influence or a reason for our behavior as well as other people's behavior. Okay, and it's always connecting some kind of cause to a behavior. Okay, because obviously we can't read other people's thoughts, we can't know what they're thinking, but we can always make judgments by how they behave or by how they act in front of us. Okay, so attribution is how we attribute or how we identify causes for our behavior as well as other people's behavior. So that is the definition there. And those are the two key words. If we ever asked you to define attribution, that would usually be worth 2 marks, and you'd be asked to mention these 2 bolded kind of key phrases there. Okay, so that's basically our main definition of what attribution is about. So let's look in a little bit more detail now into the different types of attribution. Okay, the first type of attribution is called personal attribution. Now, a personal attribution is what the name suggests. It's when we explain behavior or when we put a reason for someone's behavior and we connect it to themselves as a person. Okay, so rather than watching someone fall down in public and saying that, oh, they must have slipped on something, you kind of say that, oh, that person fell down because they're such a clumsy person, or they never look where they're going, or they're just such a careless individual, they're so irresponsible. So rather than blaming or rather than attributing an external factor to them falling down or tripping, you are attributing or you are associating their personal characteristics with that behavior that they've gone through. Okay, so a personal attribution is when we explain behavior in terms of characteristics of the person involved. So what do we mean by characteristics? Well, characteristics is simply any kind of personality related trait. So that person is clumsy, that's why they fell. That person is careless, that's why they fell. That person never looks where they're going, that's why they fell. Okay, so personal attribution is kind of, you get a clue from the name itself. Personal attributions, you connect a person's behavior to some element of their personality or personal characteristics there. Personal attributions are kind of similar to labeling. You label someone rather than saying that, oh, you know, it's something they couldn't avoid, you label that person for the behavior that they've gone through, okay? And it doesn't just happen with simple examples like falling over, but as we're going to look at in a few slides' time, even when you think about more serious situations, for example, someone getting hurt in a relationship, sometimes people might blame the person, okay? And we call that victim blaming, where rather than blaming the situation or the pressuring or stressful experience that that person had and the circumstances they were living in, people might say, oh, she just, she was basically putting herself in that situation because she's such a pushover, or she never fights for her rights. So you like blame the person essentially. So yeah, we can definitely say that personal attributions are connected to personal attacks or labeling, correct? These are some other examples here. So if someone gets the highest mark in a SAC, you might not attribute the fact that that person comes from a very positive situation, that they've got enough time to study at home, that they've got a supportive family environment to do that, but you might just attribute that to the individual person involved rather than the environment they're growing up in. So you might say she got the highest mark because she's smart. Okay, he's good at basketball, not because he goes to training, not because he works so hard, not because he's been, practicing from when he was a young boy, but he's good at basketball because he's tall. Okay, that's a personal characteristic, nothing to do with the environment or the situational factors. So a lot of the time, personal attributions are connected to kind of associating that person's personal characteristics or personality traits to the behavior that they engage in or to some skill that they're good at. Okay, and these are some other things as well. And these are some other examples. So their skills, their mood. Okay, she never makes any friends because she's always such a grumpy little grouch. So you're attributing a personality characteristics rather than saying that she never makes any friends because, everyone around her has different interests from her and no one can connect with her. So it's more of a personal attack. Okay, so that's a personal attribution. The next attribution is a little bit more contrasting, and that is called a situational attribution. So it's almost the opposite of what we just looked at before. A situational attribution is when we associate some behavior or we try to explain the behavior in terms of a situational factor. A situational factor is basically some outside factor. Usually this factor is external in nature. External means that it's not related to the actual person or their personality or who they are, but it's related to their external factors, like a situation, like the environment they're growing up in at home or the environment that they experience at school, what kind of suburb they live in, all that kind of stuff. Things that they don't control by themselves, things that are like outside of that individual person, okay? External factors. So situational attributions are when we attribute or associate external outside factors to a person's behavior rather than blaming a person's behavior on their own personal characteristics. So one example could be that if you pass a driving test, you might say that, I passed my P's because the officer or the licensing guy was really nice. He was really nice to me. He didn't seem like he was too strict. But you might have actually passed because you personally had practiced a lot and you were really skilled at driving by that point. You'd done all your hours. You'd practiced reverse parallel park like a million times. You were probably really good at it, but rather than associating you passing the driving test with your own personal skills, you've associated it with an outside factor. Okay, and people do this a lot of the time because no one wants to be seen as a show-off. So sometimes we kind of like depress or we downplay our own skills and abilities and attribute what we achieve or how we behave to some outside factor. Okay, in contrast, another example could be that someone might say, I failed the SAC because the teacher was crap. The teacher didn't teach us properly. The teacher doesn't know how to teach. Okay, so essentially in this case as well, you're attributing or you're associating an external factor, in this case the teacher, to you failing the SAC. When actually someone might have failed the SAC because they just didn't study, because they were irresponsible, because they were, not working persistently or consistently in the subject, okay? So essentially sometimes we use situational attributions so we don't feel bad or guilty, okay? So if someone fails a SAC, it's easier for them to think to themselves that, I failed because the teacher didn't teach us properly or because we weren't given enough notice, as compared to thinking that, I'm actually a responsible person. So situational attributions can be used in different ways as well. A lot of the time when we make a situational attribution, we don't blame ourselves, but we blame the actions of some other person outside of us, obviously, not ourselves. Environmental factors. So, if you come late to a assessment, and you tell your teacher that I had internet connections when actually I had problems with my internet connection, when actually maybe you mixed up the timing or some other factor was there, you might actually blame your internet connection for you coming late or your laptop issue for you coming late. And that is you attributing a outside factor to something that was actually your own fault. Okay, the task, okay, so I didn't pass the driving test because the licensing officer made me go through a really difficult route or a really difficult pathway. Luck, okay, sometimes we sometimes we're like, oh, wow, that was just, that was just a lucky shot. Or wow, that was just fate. I never expected that to happen. So a lot of the time, situational attributions are associating what happens to us or what behavior we engage in with an outside factor, not connecting it to our personality, not connecting it to our individual traits. Okay, that's situational attribution. Then we look at something else that's connected to attribution. So when we look at this topic of attributions, personal and situational attributions are your two main types of attributions, okay? Then we've got some interesting specific or special types of attribution that help us to further explain some of the behaviors that we observe in society. So one of the errors or one of the kind of issues with attribution is that sometimes we can make errors, okay? So we might attribute a certain reason to a certain behavior, but that is actually a faulty way of thinking. In other words, it's like a bias, like a cognitive bias. So the fundamental attribution error is this idea that as humans in general, we tend to overestimate the influence of personal factors. Okay, so we tend to think all the time that it's always the person that's to blame for the behavior, essentially. And we underestimate the impact of situational factors. So that means that we downplay the impact of the actual environment or the circumstances that the person is in. So the example I gave you before with, the woman or the man that's remaining in the abusive relationship. A lot of the time when you hear stories about this, there are always a group of people who will say, well, why was the man just shutting his mouth? Why didn't he speak up? Why didn't he escape? Or, why was the woman being such a pushover? Why was she allowing that to happen to her? Why wasn't she fighting for her rights? So rather than blaming the external situation of that abusive environment, of that manipulative situation that this person is in, we're blaming that individual person as not being able to escape that situation. And that is what one example of the fundamental attribution error is. We're overestimating the influence of personal factors, again, personal blame, personal attacking, and we're underestimating the actual impact of that situation, that it was such an oppressive and abusive situation that maybe escaping would have actually put the person in more harm. Okay, so again, this is just one example of the fundamental attribution error. Another example is like this comic here. Okay, a lot of the time, when you're with your parents and you're stuck in a traffic jam or something, a lot of the time we try to overestimate the influence of personal factors again. So if there's a car in front of us and there's like a lot of space between them and the car in front of them, and we're like, why doesn't this guy just move up? Oh my God, is he blind? Why isn't he moving? Or the traffic light's gone green. Why is he taking 10 seconds to react and just move the car? Like, we tend to blame that person rather than looking at the fact that being stuck in a traffic jam is quite a stressful situation, and that obviously people do lose their concentration. Okay, so we tend to overestimate and blame everyone else that's stuck in the traffic jam with us. So essentially that is what the fundamental attribution error is, putting a lot of focus on personal factors and downplaying situational factors. Sometimes it can be good, but in some instances, especially with this whole abusive situation, domestic violence example, it can actually be quite a bad thing that we do when we use the fundamental attribution error. Okay, now the next topic that we're going to look at is called the just world belief. Okay, and this is the complete opposite of the fundamental attribution error. So we'll look at that. Just get rid of these scribbles. Okay, so the just world belief is focusing a little bit more on personal factors. Okay, so when we look at the just world belief, it's this concept that the world is a fair place. Okay, and that whatever happens to people is simply their own fault and is simply what they deserve. So in other words, when we're talking about the just world belief, if you look at the term itself, just world means a world where everything is fair and just and that there's justice. Okay, so the world itself poses no major situational factors that should disadvantage anyone. Okay, and so whatever you do is your own fault. Now this is a problem, and this is a problem because we know that things like inequality exist. We know that inequity exists. We know that in the same state or in the same city, you can go to certain suburbs where there's a lot of advantage and a lot of privilege, and then you can go to other suburbs maybe just a few kilometers down the road and there is a lot of inequality and poverty. Okay, so the just world belief is a problem because even though the world is a fair place, the world is not an equal place. And so if you've got two students, for example, one who's coming from a very privileged society, or one, maybe this boy doesn't have a lot of siblings who he has to look after. Maybe he's not working extra shifts or whatever to help the family. Okay, so he's got a supportive family environment there. So he's able to work well and do well in his sex. Whereas this girl maybe has to look after her siblings all night. She's got a lot of siblings, or, you know, she has to stay up and look after them because both her parents work nights. So essentially she might be falling asleep in class, not because she is, not because she's irresponsible, but because of her environmental situations. Okay, and it's not fair for us to then say that this girl, or whatever happens to this girl and the behavior she shows, is her own fault and is what she deserves, because she couldn't actually help it. So in this example, you can see that although the world is a fair place, the just world belief needs to acknowledge that the world is not an equal place for every person. So a lot of the time when we make attributions using the just world belief, we tend to attribute people who do well, we tend to attribute them to their personal factors. So, you know, Timothy did well because he is an all-rounded well student. He is a very disciplined student. He works consistently. You know, Minnie didn't do well because, you know, she didn't work hard. She wasn't consistent. Okay, and we're not, again, acknowledging that maybe Minnie came from, you know, a lower class kind of, sorry, not lower class, like a more working class environment where her family didn't have enough money to buy her study guides or send her to tutoring or give her extra support. Okay, so essentially the just world belief is a problem. Okay, it's just like the fundamental attribution error. It is a problematic way of attributing behaviors because we don't take into consideration those situational factors like the environment you're growing up in, how many siblings you have, how much money your parents have, like income to support you, whether you've got an existing chronic illness, or whether your parents or your siblings have a chronic illness that does affect the dynamic of the family, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so the just world belief operates on this idea that the world is a fair place, but we know that the world is often not a fair place, and that is exacerbated by the presence of very subtle and sometimes very obvious inequalities across people. Okay, so that is the just world belief. The actor-observer bias is another type of bias or faulty way or faulty attribution. And actor-observer bias is this idea or this tendency for us to attribute our own behavior to external or situational causes, and yet attribute others' behavior to internal or personal factors. And so sometimes when we go through this topic, I often think of the actor-observer bias. Like someone who shows the actor-observer bias would probably be someone who you would call a hypocrite, simply because, I'll give you an example. So if you say, for example, let's say, you know, you've come late to an assessment, and then you've said that my laptop wasn't working, so I'm late, okay? And that's a genuine excuse for you. But if someone else is to come late to an assessment or to a group meeting that you're having, and they say that my laptop wasn't working properly and that's why I'm late, you kind of like judge them, and you kind of like, yeah, right, like that's such a stupid excuse. So even though you used the same excuse a few days prior, you're attributing their behavior to internal or personal factors, that, yep, that person's just a careless person, that's why they're late. But when it comes to you being late, you attribute your own behavior of being late to external factors or situational factors, like my laptop wasn't working properly. Okay, and it's also called the actor-observer discrepancy because there's a mismatch between what you think of your own behavior compared to what you think of another person's behavior. So if we look at this comic, this Charlie Brown comic here, the boy asks, why are you always so anxious to criticize me? And then Lucy says, I just think I have a knack for seeing other people's faults. And then he asks, what about your own faults? And then she says, I have a knack for overlooking them. So that's what the actor-observer bias is, that when we are an actor, when we're acting out our own behavior, we blame it on external causes. But when we're watching or observing other people's behavior, we blame it on their own personal factors or internal factors like personality characteristics. Okay, that's the actor-observer bias. And it's called a bias because it's not an equal way of thinking. There is a mismatch there. Okay, so then we've got one more to go, or two more to go. The next type of bias is called self-serving bias. Now, self-serving bias suggests that we take credit for our successes and we attribute our failures to situational factors. So when we judge ourselves or when we make an evaluation of ourselves, whenever something good happens to us, we take the credit for that. So for example, if you're a student and you get A+, you're like, wow, I got A+. I'm going to take the credit for that. I'm so smart. So when you get an A+, you obviously judge that as a personal attribution and you take the credit for that. You praise yourself in your head. But when something bad happens, or when something goes south, like for example, this same girl, if she gets a D in the next SAC or an E or an F, she is basically going to then say, you know what, this teacher doesn't like me. That's why I got an F for this SAC, when actually I deserve more. So when good things happen to us, we take the credit for them. When bad things happen for us, we distance ourselves away from that reason as much as possible, and we try to associate a situational or external factor to that result. Okay, so I failed the SAC because I wasn't given enough notice to study. That is an example of a situational attribution, and another example of one side of the self-serving bias. And if you say I passed the SAC because I worked hard, then that is an example of a personal attribution, and again showing you that that's self-serving. Okay, remember the word self-serving means that you serve yourself. So whatever you think, it's in your best interest. It's for your own good or for your own benefit there. Okay, now one explanation of why we show the self-serving bias isn't that we're just inherently selfish people who are all up in our egos all the time. It's actually to protect our self-esteem. If you get an F in a SAC, you don't want to admit to yourself that, you might actually have overestimated your abilities. So you try to protect your self-esteem by saying, okay, we didn't have enough time to finish the SAC, or I didn't study, we weren't given enough study resources, or, my teacher is just a harsh marker. So this is what the self-serving bias is about. And this is why it's important, because it helps us to protect our self-esteem. And there has been research that has been conducted that the reason we want to protect our self-esteem is that we always want to try to manage this positive reputation in front of others. Okay, we don't want people to think that, oh, she got an F and she's inherently such an incapable person in the subject. So essentially we try to create other reasons to explain why we got an F or why we didn't do well in a test. So that's the self-serving bias. And the last one that we're looking at for today is culture and attribution. So cultural factors, culture always comes up everywhere because culture is such a strong differentiating factor for a lot of different behaviors, and social behaviors are no different. So if you remember in the last lesson, I talked about the fact that, certain gestures like putting a thumbs up might be considered positive in one culture, but might be rude or offensive in another culture. So when we're talking about attributions as well, attributions can also be different depending on the culture that you're looking at. So in individualist cultures, for example, cultures where freedom, democracy, hard work, personal gain, all those things are valued. So cultures like Australia, America, any Western culture essentially, individualist cultures tend to focus on the individual's achievement and individual growth. And so they tend to put more of a focus on personal attributions, okay? So generally in countries like Australia, America, UK, you're not going to hear the Prime Minister saying that, you're not going to hear famous people kind of like attributing that the country worked hard and that's why they got into that position. They generally talk about themselves that, I was working hard for this. I was always aspiring to be this leader. I was always aspiring to get on the Australian soccer team. Okay. It's always about I. Okay. So remember, individualist cultures starts with the letter I, and it's a focus on I. All about the personal, okay, personal attributions there. When we're talking about collectivist cultures are more like Asian cultures, okay? In Asian cultures, you might have, especially probably China's the best example there. Certain kind of political ideologies like communism suggest that, it's not just about the individual person, but about the country as a whole, and that everyone has to work together to achieve any kind of growth for the country or any kind of progression for the country. So collectivist cultures tend to associate the behavior of others to situational attributions. So he's a famous sports player because his team always kind of like, encouraged him. He got to the role of prime minister because his country voted him in and his country was always supportive of him, not because he was like a good leader or because he had other positive qualities. So in collectivist cultures, we tend to focus more on the situational and less on the personal, okay? Whereas in individualist cultures, we focus more on the personal individual rather than the situations that they've been in. So just one final example, Lee's soccer team wins the final. So if Lee is from an individualist culture like Australia, for example, he might explain the victory in the post-match interview as he might basically explain that victory as a result of his or his teammates' skill playing. Whereas if he was a collectivist culture, he might attribute the win to situational factors such as a lucky goal, or that his team was encouraging him throughout the whole season, or that the other team was missing their star player. So this kind of comes out of this idea as well that in Asian cultures, where a lot of your collectivist cultures reside, in these Asian countries, there tends to be a very big focus on humility and being humble and not being very egocentric, not being very boastful. Okay, these are characteristics that they very much value. And so when you say something like, oh, it was a lucky goal, or, God had decided for me to kick that lucky goal that day, you get a lot more respect in those cultures as compared to just being the biggest show off in the world and saying, oh yeah, it's because I'm such a skilled player, or it's because, my teammate was, it's because my teammate and I were practicing all the day and we just became so proficient in our field. So rather than showing off, that's why collectivist cultures such as Asian cultures do value attributing situational factors to behavior. Okay, so that's basically what culture and attribution and the relationship between those two concepts are about. So I'm just going to stop the recording here.